It is 10 p.m. Central African Time, coming to you from the SABC Centre in Johannesburg. This is the Globe on SABC News. Good evening and a warm welcome to it. I'm Simpian Gawani.
A very good evening to you and thank you for joining us. I'm Lulu Gabu. Let's go on to our top story. The unveiling of Sudan's Sovereign Council, which will govern the country's transition to civilian rule, has been postponed until Tuesday.
Well, that's according to military rulers. The lineup was due to have been announced on Sunday in line with a deal reached between the Transitional Military Council and an opposition coalition.
The Transitional Military Council, which took over from Omar Al-Bashir's government after he was forced from power in April, issued a statement on Monday. They said its own dissolution and the formation of the Sovereign Council were postponed for 48 hours. It said the extension was granted at the request of the Forces for Freedom and Change after they came back on some of the 5 names they put forward on Sunday. The FFC is the main opposition umbrella, which was initially called the Alliance for Freedom and Change. They are representing the leaders of the month-long protest that brought down Al-Bashir's government. The ruling Sovereign Council will be composed of 11 members, including 6 civilians and 5 from the military. It will be headed by a general for the first 21 months and by a civilian for the remaining 18 months. The council will oversee the formation of a transitional civilian administration, including a cabinet and a legislative body.
A police detective told a Sudanese court on Monday at the start of a corruption trial that ousted President Omar Hassan Al-Bashir acknowledged receiving millions of US dollars from Saudi Arabia.
Al-Bashir is charged with illicit possession of foreign currency and accepting gifts in an unofficial manner. Bashir's lawyer dismissed those accusations, telling reporters that after that hearing, it was usual for leaders to hold amounts of foreign currency. The next hearing is scheduled for Saturday.
Sudan's ousted President Omar Hassan al-Bashir on Monday arrived amid heavy security at the courthouse in the capital Khartoum, where he is facing corruption charges. Bashir was also charged in May with incitement and involvement in the killing of protesters, and prosecutors also want him questioned over suspected money laundering and terrorism financing. His trial will be a test of how serious authorities are about trying to erase the legacy of his autocratic 30-year rule, marked by widespread violence, economic collapse, and the secession of South Sudan. On Saturday, Sudan's ruling military council, which took over after Bashir was ousted in April, signed a power-sharing agreement with the main opposition coalition, paving the way for a transitional government and eventual elections. It sets up a sovereign council as the highest authority in the country, but largely delegates executive powers to the cabinet of ministers.
Joining us via Skype is Dr Jok Madut Jok from the University of South Sudan. Dr Jok, good evening and thank you so much for joining us on the Globe.
Thank you, ma'am. Good to be here.
Now, Dr Jok, is this a new dawn for Sudan?
Oh, it is definitely a new dawn, even though the people have been experiencing tension and heart-wrenching fear for the last 8 months. To the agreement that was reached to form a council, a ruling council for the transitional period, was definitely a moment that saw the Sudanese people erupting into a euphoric movement to the point where people travel from various towns across the country to come to Khartoum in order to attend the ceremony of the unveiling of the council, which was supposed to happen yesterday, Sunday. Unfortunately, this unveiling has been postponed until Tuesday for a variety of reasons.
What are those reasons, Dr. Jok?
Yes.
What are those reasons? Why the postponement?
The main reason is that the ruling military, the military leaders who have taken over the past several months since Al-Bashir exited are still unsure whether the transitional government is going to come for their necks in the same way that Al-Bashir is now wanted to be put on trial. Today was the first time that Al-Bashir showed up in court on charges of corruption. Many of these leaders, including Burhan, including Hameti, are all also people that the Sudanese people expect to have their day in court, and they don't want that. So the Transitional Military Council is dragging its feet on the announcement of the transitional government that is reached as a part of the agreement between the protesters, the leaders in the protesting movement, and the military council. They are dragging their feet primarily because they fear that some of them might experience the same fate as Al-Bashir, especially those of them who will not be part of the new cabinet. That's one main reason. The other reason, of course, is that the Sudanese military leaders, since the beginning of the North-South War some 40 years ago, have never signed an agreement that they intend to implement. And the implementation of any agreement is often a continuation of negotiation. So as they agreed, they still thought that there is room for them to wiggle out of some of the responsibilities and expectations that the public is putting on them. And so the delay is to allow for them to negotiate a certain structure within the sovereign council, as it will be called. They want more military on it. They want civilian and political leaders who are leaning towards supporting them rather than a large number of political leaders who are coming from the protest movement, who will all be interested in ensuring that some of these leaders see their day in court.
Now, let's speak about other issues, for instance, the steps that need to be taken, before embarking on this long and obstacle-littered road until 2022, where elections are expected to take place. What do you think those steps are going to be, and, what should be the expectation going forward?
The main expectation is that there will be a constitutional process that will produce a constitution that is not necessarily referred to as a secular constitution, but one that limits the role of religion in state affairs. There is going to be a strong provision in this constitution for respect for basic civil rights. There will be a provision for some sort of reparations for the areas most affected by war in Darfur, in Kordofan, in Blue Nile. And so the military leaders are not really so keen on ensuring that this constitution goes forward, because that constitution will call for an overhaul of the system of government in Sudan. I think that is the next step, and that is what the protest movement is certainly committed to achieving, to change the Sudan from a country where a small minority of Arabized groups control the state from the center at the expense of the vast territory and diverse hinterland of the country. The other issue, of course, is to do with the Sudan's position in global affairs, in regional affairs, particularly in the Horn of Africa, and particularly in relation to South Sudan and to the relationship with Ethiopia, with regards to Nile water, the relationship with Egypt. And so the Sudanese protesters, the leaders who were behind the protest, are saying that Sudan has to take its rightful place in the Congress of Nations, where it is a good citizen of the region, whereas the military leaders are particularly interested in continuing strong relations with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, with Egypt, and not particularly with Africa.
Now, just speaking of UAE and Saudi Arabia, we see that the former president of Sudan, Omar Hassan Al-Bashir, has appeared in court, and the unveiling of the millions of dollars that were found in his home, with his attorney stating that this was the usual stuff that leaders are generally found to have, cash all over their properties. What's your take on this and the reasons behind, Omar Al-Bashir having that amount of money, and why did Saudi Arabia give Omar Al-Bashir so much cash?
Yes, indeed, Saudi Arabia and UAE were big underwriters of Al-Bashir's reign of power, because Al-Bashir is a contributor to the allied forces that are fighting in Yemen on behalf of Saudi Arabia. So in exchange for Sudanese troops being sent to Yemen, Al-Bashir was able to cash in. That's one source of that money. The other source of that money, of course, is national and natural resources of Sudan, where the oil money was always controlled by Al-Bashir and his cronies. And so the overflow of cash into state houses and palaces of the ruling elite during Al-Bashir was limitless. And this was evidenced by how much cash was found in their houses. Now, being put on trial for corruption, according to the protesters, being put on trial for corruption is definitely important. But what they really want him for are the violations that have happened within Khartoum against protesters, the killing of protesters in 2015 and 2016, and then again in 2019. But also the atrocities that were committed in Darfur, the genocide in South Sudan, for which the President Al-Bashir was indicted by the ICC and is still a wanted man to be tried in The Hague. So the Sudanese people, while concerned about the mismanagement of their resources and the disruption and destruction of the economy of Sudan, the Sudanese people are also interested in finding a way to have Al-Bashir answer to questions on atrocities that were committed throughout the years of his rule.
Do you think it's too early for Sudanese people to be celebrating, just having seen reports of once a signing was done and had taken place and the document was initialed, the Sudanese people went out to the newly named Freedom Square where celebrations were taking place. Do you think that it should be a wait and see situation where the Sovereign Council is named and people are then given posts moving forward?
No, it's never too late for Sudanese to celebrate because that celebration is, in a sense, a continuation of the protest until the government is announced, until they are satisfied with the formation of the Sovereign Council. And so while they are celebrating their achievements so far, including the removal of Al-Bashir, including the pressure on the ruling council to agree to this formation of the Sovereign Council, all of these things are things that are worth celebrating because the Sudanese people have achieved a momentous occasion of being among the first countries within sub-Saharan Africa to topple a dictator by simply staging a peaceful protest by everyone, including children, women, old people went on the street. So the Sudanese people are basically teaching the African continent a political culture that is not seen anywhere since the uprising in Tunisia and Egypt.
Dr. Jok, do you think that the suspension of Sudan by the African Union should be lifted after these developments?
Oh, I think it should be lifted once the Sovereign Council is announced, because once that is announced, the lifting of that ban will be a kind of African Union celebration of the achievement of the Sudanese people.
Dr. Jok, in terms of we touched on the issue of the generals wanting to lead the country, the first period and then the latter period of the transitional agreement will be under civilian rule. those sort of issues, do you think that this will give Sudanese people enough time to ensure that the government that is put in place going forward will be the government of the people, which is a civilian government?
The most important thing about the transitional period is the preparation for election. And the reason why the negotiation, part of the reason for negotiation taking so long was that the military people wanted a very brief period, a transitional period, such that when the elections are declared, before the political parties and the protest movement have organized themselves, the military junta can actually doctor the elections and bring into office some of their supporters. Whereas the FFC wanted a longer period, a transitional period, so that they can prepare themselves for elections. So I think the most important thing during the transitional period is for the opposition that was staging this protest to finally organize themselves into political parties that can win elections and that can now set up an elected government that is to the desire of the people of Sudan. But before you get to that, it is important that the Sovereign Council has the tenets of the making of a would-be democratic society, including a powerful role being given to the parliament, role being given to civic liberties, so that people are no longer suppressed and the media is open. These are the workings of what will make Sudan transition away from autocracy into a democratic society. That is really the gist of what should happen during the transitional period, to restore Sudan to an open, democratic society.
Dr. Jok, always a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time. That is Dr. Jok Madut Jok from the University of South Sudan joining us via